what happens next? How do we move it forward? We have expertise.
Can I, as a sort of a wrapping up kind of thought, listening to what all three of my colleagues.
You can after I finish, Peter.
Okay.
If that's okay, if you don't mind.
Absolutely not.
Thanks.
You do? Yes, I don't mind.
That's good. So basically, what I'm saying was, you've been talking about transformation. How do we transform it? We have expertise within our community. Have we made a difference? I mean, is the world actually better at crisis management? We looked at COVID. We looked at Houston, Texas, 2021 snowstorms. We've looked at a whole range of situations. And the question is, we have the expertise, but where is the impact? Where is the influence? Where's the legacy? So if we are to have influence and impact and legacy, then what is our responsibility as a global community of experts? And based on that, Peter, feel free to take it away. Thanks.
Well, yeah, what I was going to ask was, in a way, relevant. It's a very good question you're asking, because this question of this issue of communication in a crisis and social media particularly, which is our main means of getting messages out in these things, I would be interested in what is the best thinking on this. We've just had some recent examples where there's quite a good example of how social media has worked really surprisingly well because of a particular individual who becomes a really trusted source. There's another story from a few years back, the other side of Cape Town where I live, where the mayor completely got in the way and wrecked the best communication plans. So I'm sure there is some very good thinking on that. And my thought about the ISRM is that there's an amazing amount of expertise, as you say, in it. I think one of the best things the ISRM can do is what you're doing right now, which is providing a kind of a listening space where these people can come together and listen to each other. I don't think the ISRM can task itself with solving big chunks of this global crisis management directly, but it's one of the very few places where this kind of diversity of expertise can come together in various ways to listen to each other. That's my thought.
As you know, Peter, because you've been involved since the very beginning, but our mission statement from day one was that the purpose of the mission of the ISRM was to create a space and platform where academics, practitioners, and policymakers could come together to have a grown-up conversation. I mean, that was it. And I think this demonstrates that we're trying to achieve that. But also that there is a recognition amongst the global community that there is a need for this space where this can happen. And as you say, we're very proud of that we are creating a space, and hopefully that's working for so many people. Richard, let's come to you. Because, your job is to make a difference in the world. All of our job is to make a difference, but you're working and you're going in, you're being paid money to make a difference. Are we genuinely making a difference? Are we, or not?
Yeah, I think there are a few things here. Just to come back on that big exam question that you made. I think we've clearly been through a lot of crises, or some very big crises in the last few years, and I think it's helpful that some of those crises have been followed by some quite large scale inquiries and investigations as to how did we do during those, and therefore, and some of those have been really quite transparent and really quite sort of open in the views that have come forward. And I think that is very helpful for recognizing the effectiveness of prior arrangements on that and for being able to make new ones on the back of that. Yeah. So I think that will helpful, and obviously the pandemic being the obvious one, and there's a massive inquiry underway in the UK on that. Yeah, I think on the back of that and various things, and this recognition of a changing world and in a number of different areas, and therefore a changing sense of what a future crisis might look like, I think I do see countries overall that are revamping their resilience arrangements overall, not just the UK. I see it in other countries as well. And this, of course, needs to filter down to cities in terms of how they recognise what they might be hit by as well. So I think there is a movement in that area, and therefore perhaps the beginnings from both that and the previous and the inquiries of a better playbook, or stronger playbook, because there is a very strong set of lessons, out there as to how to manage, crises more effectively. I don't think we are doing enough, testing, just to reiterate the point that was made earlier, and preparedness and exercising on that. And if we are, we're not doing that in a properly sort of cross-sectoral way in most countries. Yes, it's often between different agencies within government. In fact, only in certain countries, and I can come back to Scandinavia, does it actually involve the private sector as well, and rarely does it actually is a community-wide set of arrangements on that as well. I think there is also huge untested scope for working with understanding the correct relationship, or the best relationship between the public and private sectors in terms of managing a crisis as well. I think this is very underdeveloped in terms of actually governments understanding what levers they can use in order to do that, where they need to have more of a fiat or legislative or regulatory sort of lever, where there's things that they may need to be more incentive based, and things where actually they need to do greater facilitation to break down some of the barriers for engagement by private sector, and in particular where private sector might be able to collaborate with each other, but sometimes you need to have a special dispensation from antitrust concerns relating to that. Yeah. So again, I don't see enough of those in place at the moment, and I think that would act as a more transformational, more coherent way of addressing some of the crises overall. And so I think my sort of last point here is really around that sort of we are moving into quite a different world at the moment, and are we having strong enough or detailed enough conversations with communities around this in terms of their role, their engagement, their level of responsibility. There's no way all these things can be solved from the top down by responses. We need to have that devolve that sense of responsibility to the lowest level. Governments are too strapped for resources. Coordination arrangements are always difficult. So therefore, actually being able to begin that conversation, the governments are always shy. City government, national government, are always shy about having that sense of speaking to communities, or they're often shy about speaking to communities about risk and bad things because they want to project more positive stories. But I think we do need to do that more effectively, so everyone understands what their particular role and the opportunities for that are in terms of where we go forward.
It's interesting because after every single crisis, there is a post-crisis inquiry and report. And if you read the executive summary, it's exactly the same thing every damn time. I mean, and you can write it on day 3 of the crisis. You can write the executive summary. I mean, you look at what's going on in the COVID UK, and a lot of times it just seems that the senior management, whatever that means, is just not fit for purpose. When tested by a genuine crisis event, it disappears, and that is no longer a technical issue. That is a moral responsibility. If you're in that job, you have the moral responsibility to be ready, because that's part of your job description. Doug, New Zealand is a good case study because it's been through a lot of crises. Jacinda Ardern, by most accounts, had a pretty good COVID experience, by most accounts. Was there anything specific in the New Zealand history that allowed that to happen? Because they've been through a number of crises, and the earthquake, of course. Had that built up a capacity capability?
Yes, and I'll give some context for that. The Jacinda Ardern government and her administration, easy to forget that before COVID there was the White Island disaster in New Zealand. There was the Christchurch, I'll call it the Christchurch disaster, and we'll leave it at that. And a number of earthquakes and other incidences that had a severe impact on the government's ability to drive its program of work. But across all of that, what was celebrated across that internationally, from what was seen from her response and the government's response, was a strength in communication and crisis communications, to come to what we were talking to before, and a level of trust building that was almost unparalleled throughout. it's a point that I made earlier that I'll bring back again around that trust in the decision-making process and the ability to have a framework in place that works well in a crisis situation, because more often than not, decision-making in an organizational context, in a private sector context, can become incredibly efficient during a crisis because everything else goes to the wayside and you have your senior executive team in a room and can make decisions very quickly as long as they have the information to do those. And the challenge can actually be to drive back towards a BAU decision-making process. To answer your question directly, David, the constitutional model in New Zealand with a unicameral government and the ability in that for the senior executive team, essentially, of the New Zealand government to operate and manage the country across a unicameral government and to centralise that decision making has always been there constitutionally in New Zealand. It works very well. What it doesn't have is probably the strength of checks and balances that are in place in other countries, and there will always be a balance across that. And that echoes in a city management context, and echoes in a corporate context, and there echoes in other government contexts as well, in terms of how the decision-making processes are set up to be managing those and whether or not it is empowering the key leaders to be really, really strong and concise in terms of their own messaging, which is what we saw out of New Zealand. And just as a final point on that, to build on what you were saying before, Richard, as well, what we saw in that context was a strength in terms of the public-private partnerships that were being put in place around the COVID context, where the government was able to step back and allow the private sector to be able to work to its own strength and manage its own supply chains in that crisis situation. And then the government to step in as appropriate and to be managing the public side of that, or to build in the redundancy in terms of its own systems to be able to flex and manage the crisis from that perspective. It's easier to do in a smaller country like New Zealand, and especially in a country with incredibly consolidated industries and really a handful of key, macro processes that you're looking to maintain and manage at a national level. The complexity of a larger country, I would question how much that can be put in place before those processes start breaking down in the other direction. But that PPP approach is absolutely fundamental. And really from a national perspective, a local perspective, and from a private organisation perspective, being able to rely on that and have that trust that that process will work becomes absolutely fundamental.
Good stuff. I mean, the way you learn to deal with a crisis, you have a crisis. The second time around, you get it right more or less. The first time you don't. Sherrod, you guys have been, the Caribbean has been through multiple crises and there's been learning there. I learned we've come back to. Just as a summation, I mean, anything that you can pass on words of wisdom, this is how you do it. This is what you need to think about.
Well, I think Peter set a really good context, and I think Richard and Douglas started hitting the nail on the head. When we look at when we talk about how far we've come, I think we're rolling a log uphill, but the log is cut into three sections. We're looking at our knowledge, our education, and awareness. We're looking at our consultation, our collaboration aspect, and then we're looking at implementation. And unfortunately, those three pieces, they're not all moving up uniformly at the same rate. I mean, in terms of when we look at the knowledge aspect of it, I mean, it's way out in front. From my former life, dealing with an environmental NGO, I've seen the change in the last couple of decades with persons now being exposed to that, are calling into the disaster management when they notice certain things in their communities. So we know that they have that awareness and that orientation. We really need to get that consultation and collaboration aspect moving well. And I think we've learned a lot of lessons. I think for us, in the Caribbean, we had a seminal year in 2021 because we had COVID going on, but then we had the St. Vincent and Grenadines volcanic eruption. Then we had floods in Guyana and Suriname, and you had the earthquake in Haiti. And what we saw is that learning out of what initially happened with COVID, because we were used to functioning in a very face-to-face operational paradigm, where now you had to do a lot more things by remote based on the situation and the pandemic going on. And we learned quite a lot because at the end of 2021, all mobilized regional teams that went out and were mobilized to these areas and so on, not a single person came back with COVID because of the learning that happened, or the protocols, our operations we had to review. So we see here that there's that effort there. There's that ability for us to actually pick up things rather quickly. But then when we still come to that whole coordination and collaboration aspect, I think that is one of the challenges that we're having in terms of mobilizing persons. And Douglas made a very good point. Richard also emphasized that point, this one. Bringing these persons in at the front end, bringing that private sector in and sitting down with them to say, these are the things we're looking about doing in the future, how we develop that. Okay, and have them work with you to say, okay, well, this is what is happening in our particular industry. This is the way that we're planning on moving forward based on what you're setting in terms of that national context or that framework. We can now look to mobilize our partners and our members and everything and so on to move in a particular direction that makes us more of an operational partner to you in times of emergencies outside of regular operation. So there's that learning aspect to it. So we really, yes, we've done the lessons learned. We now need to translate it into lessons lived. Okay, it needs to now start changing how we live, how we operate, how the simple things we do. And I think that is where one good measuring indicator we have is not so much the larger things, because that pulls our focus. It's the little things. It's the little everyday things. How is the public interacting with us? Are they aware? Is this part of their regular cognitive toolkit? In other words, when they see certain things happening, do they feel empowered to engage? Okay, passing along the information is one thing and so on, but have we gotten them to the point where they feel comfortable, in other words, to mobilize themselves to do something so that we can see now the change in behavior and the implementation aspect that comes out of it, and holding the various structures that hold up society to a level that we can get to where we need to get to and take it out of the realm of discussion and academics and theory and implement it into the practical aspect of our daily living. So we really need to look at and so on. How do we make disaster management part of our daily behavior?
Sherrod, thank you for that. Peter, we'll give you the last word. Over to you.
I just want to say how much I've enjoyed this conversation. And I suspect there's some really beautiful contributions that have been made or could have been made from our audience too. But we simply don't yet know how to do this sort of four-dimensional dialogue. I'm sure we'll get there. We just need a few more crises to tip us into that. No, my head is buzzing with rich ideas and experience from my three colleagues and yourself, David. So thank you very, very much.
There is an academic concept, this idea of rich information, that you get information and you build a picture from it, but to use your phrase, not just a three-dimensional picture, but a four-dimensional picture, because you can use it to project into the future. And I think that's what we're doing here. This is what the ISRM is about. I'd like to thank everybody here, Peter Willis, Richard Smith-Bingham, Sherrod, James, Douglas Gray, each of you bringing a lifetime of experience and dedication. Thank you. I would like to ask everybody in the global audience to thank them. I'd like everybody in your global audience to thank yourselves for being here, but also for your contribution. I mean, we will publish, we do capture your comments. That will be published. We value that. I think the ISRM has delivered its aims today to have a conversation that has meaning and significance. If any of you would like to be involved in the ISRM, you'd be very welcome to do so. We'd be delighted to speak to you about that, have you as members or fellows. If any of you are an institution that is involved in this sort of stuff, speak to us. We have a global network of institutions. We love working with institutions. Please do let us know. And then what we'll be doing tomorrow is, I think that tomorrow morning, we will be having a final sum up session just in the morning, inviting all of our panelists back, those of you who can come in, just for a roundtable discussion. I think has been of real value. We could go on for a long, long time. But for today, to everybody, thank you wherever you are in the world. Stay safe. Thank you. And we'll see you soon. God bless.
All right, guys. Y'all have a great day. If you can't have a great day, have a fantastic one instead.
It sounds better when you say it in that accent rather than coming from Manchester. Let me tell you, it sounds different. I don't know how it is. But Sherrod, thank you. It's great to have you on here. Really appreciate the contribution.
All right. Stay safe, everyone.
All the best, everybody. Okay. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.